I'm trying to think. The AMC series wasn't for me. Wasn't for me at all. Some of these other things that are on here, I'm going to talk about Pillion in a second. And okay, maybe I'll just do a quick pause, see if there are any thoughts. Um, so the Brad thing, I'm not going to talk about it here, but high level, he wasn't a great husband or father, it seems. And so that is coming into the light, and it's not looking good for Brad. Hello, friend. I'm just gonna do a quick little thing on Pillion and probably be out of here by 8:30, 8:35. So if there are questions, you can drop them in here and I'll try to answer them towards the end. But I'm gonna do a quick little thing on Pillion because I'm really happy with what I wrote on here. Let me see if I can make this a little bit larger, even though I know this text will be hard to read. Okay, so basically, I found out about Pillion from Actors on Actors, watching Alexander and Stellan Skarsgård, father and son, and him saying, or being asked if it was difficult to watch his son be naked. And I was like, what is he naked in? Like, yes, he's attractive, but also, like, what is he naked in? And, like, how, whatever. And so I was holding my breath going in once I figured out what it was. I never watched the trailer, mostly because I find that a lot of white queer movies are just like a little not interesting to me. Like, I was never interested in Red, White, and Royal or the white gays being happy. I'm just a fan of seeing queer representation that feels interesting, a good tension. Also, I think a lot of this has to do with me growing up before gay marriage was legalized. I think that's super important context of understanding where, like, what age were you and situated where and what gay rights were, I think can inform, I would say, the stories that you see and how you view them. And I think that that's just like really helpful to sort of lay out there. And so the film itself, my goodness, I love the film. I thought that the acting, the writing, directing, the cinematography was so great. And it really made me think I need to start trying to find out about indie movies while they're still in the theater. And I don't really know the way to know which ones are going to be like, prized and acclaimed. And maybe it's about me figuring out who are the critics that I should be following. Ooh, that's a good one. I'll figure that out. Who are the critics that I should be following who like these films? And then that way I'll know what to watch so I can watch it in theaters and support them versus, the other ways in which I watch some of these movies, which doesn't help the movie make money. So I thought that the movie just kept me so hooked like the entire way. There was some cringe, there were some erotic moments, there was just, I love when a movie leaves me with questions, not because the movie didn't answer them per se, or that the movie was not well done, but like, how does this story end? Who are these people? Do I know people like this in real life? What does it take for someone to sign up for a life of BDSM? Who else has seen this film? Those are the kinds of questions that make me think, oh my goodness, this movie has made me think, kind of how I view a book. I think the other distinction is I watch movies as somebody who reads books. And so what I'm looking for in a movie is probably similar to how a good book is written. And I know that's not how everybody watches movies, but unfortunately that is that is the lens through which I watch movies. The themes and the elements, I would say, are intentionality, curiosity, and boundaries. There's obviously some very clear other themes that are in the movie about kink and BDSM. And, I think that my approach to this is always to wonder how that person gets into it, but not from a judgmental lane. Sort of almost like, how did you first come to know that you like chocolate chip cookies over oatmeal raisin? Or how did you come to know that snickerdoodles were tasty? I don't like snickerdoodles. And I think I maybe had them once. And I think I've had sugar cookies. I don't really like those. I love chocolate chip. I love oatmeal chocolate chip. And I would probably ask someone, and I have asked men, especially when it comes to like Reese's and Twix, what do you like about this? Like, what does it taste like? Tell me about the mouthfeel. Because now, that's not for everybody, right? Like, everybody is not going to be the person who's going to ask all these questions. That is just who I am as a person. That's who I love to be. I love to just sort of understand who people are at the core. And, I try to think to myself, what would it take for this to be appealing to me? I think that there's something really interesting about trying to get into... when I say get into the mind, that sounds wrong, but I think what it ultimately is called empathy, right? Empathy and compassion. Like, how do I understand why this matters or is important to this person? I just think is really important to me. Also, the idea of boundaries. I think that what BDSM and the kink community have are explicit rules around consent, which don't always exist outside of those spaces, which I think the broader communities can learn a lot about consent, disclosure, and conversations and such. Now, the thing about the film Pillion specifically is that some people would say that consent was not discussed enough. And while I understand that, I would say that I think that's the point. The point is that he gets and arrives to the place of understanding what his boundaries should be once he has been in a relationship that doesn't make sense for him, right? Like, so it's easy, yes, that people might walk away maligning the BDSM community, but even in the movie, if you watch, they talk about kissing and intimacy and other things where it seems, at least to me, but it could also be because of the baseline knowledge that I have, that the relationship between the main characters is not fully encapsulating the entire BDSM experience, but is meant to be like one person's experience that is probably not ideal. I think that's like part of the point. And then by the time you get to the end, there's this redemptive hero moment where he has a clear idea of what his boundaries are, and he's found a way to integrate his desires into his life, which I think that's what we're all aiming to do, is figure out how do we integrate what we want. So I started thinking about, like, what if they had a black version of this? And then I thought, black people are so socially conservative. I don't know what that would look like, because black gay men are so deeply tied to the church. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for why black gay men don't like to talk about kinks and BDSM, or really just, I would say, sex more broadly. And I use some of my experiences on Twitter to come up with a framework where I'm really excited because I've been meaning to make a video on this for so long, and I just really haven't. So this is my schematic of how a kink becomes a norm. So from my experience of being on Black Gay Twitter and some other forms of social media, is that stage one is the rise of that behavior. So let's say it is spitting, water sports, choking, even though some of those have not entered into the mainstream yet. So I would say it's the rise of the behavior. So the majority sentiment is that's disgusting. I would never do that. But then there's the niche community that has an alt Twitter, an alternative Twitter, where that thing is growing in popularity. And then there's stage two, which I would call like the subversive discussion, right? Which is people saying, I'm not into that, but I can make a case. And so they go, oh, there's a really attractive person who likes that thing. And so even though it's something that I don't like, I would consider doing it because I like that person. And then within the niche community, it becomes well known and it becomes to sort of gain traction. And I'll use some examples that we'll move through of how I think some of these have shown up. So now we're getting to this purple stage, this sort of the pre-tipping point. So within a small minority of people, it's now vocal on the main, where people talk about that as a preference. And then for notable creators, as collaborations and dabbling begin. So now it's starting to seep into the certain fans who collaborate and who start to sort of dabble in that space. And so now we get to the place where it becomes somewhat normalized, where we're hitting stage four, so the rising popularity. So the notable creators, their experimentation is driving engagement in this kink, this behavior, and then there's less shame in online discussions. That's rising popularity. Then we get to the peak popularity, where we see content across different demographics, and the main line is proudly affirming this behavior. You might even see people who previously put down that behavior and talking about how disgusting and how gross it is, now saying, oh, I've always been into this, but I was too ashamed to admit it, right? Now that it's peak popular. Then we get to the normalization, where it's deemed acceptable and valid, and you have people who, again, are saying, like, I was always into it, or you know, it's almost, this reminds me of like the S curve of adoption and marketing, which is kind of how I sort of thought about a lot of this. Is sort of, you have your early adopters, like your mains and your laggards, and then you get to standardization, where it's standard, it's discussed without shame. It's sort of, it's a part of the choreography of a hookup. So I'll give you a few examples, and then I probably should call it a night so I can eat. And then again, if there are any questions, I'll jump off in 7 minutes. But I would say there was a moment where hooking up with larger and thick men was something that a lot of the mainline Black gays, gay men on Twitter were not doing, right? And then content creators started feeling like they were in their Rosa Parks bag by collaborating with a bigger bodied person and thinking that that was progress. Now, it might be progress for them, and you might say that it could hurt their bottom line, because if that's not what people are into, then it impacts them financially. But from a moral perspective, an inclusion perspective, a lot of people are sleeping with bigger men. And so for this to even be viewed as something that eventually became normalized. Now, I do not think that we see as much body diversity or sort of mixed body pairing, coupling, collaborating on the apps with the fans and things like that. But I think some clearer ones were about spit. People were spitting during the act, and that became something that I think people would be like, that's gross, why would I ever do that? To now you see it being so normalized that people don't even think about it, that when you're on a hookup app, people don't say that that's that weird, right? Similarly, I would say choking is something that I feel like has had its curve of, oh, I would never do that, I don't want anybody to disrespect me, to people sort of seeing it in the mainstream, and then now sort of it becoming normalized and not that aberrant, not that, in a fun twist of words, queer. I would also say that we saw this with people collaborating with trans men, right? It was sort of, I think that trans men have always been able to attract sexual partners, but I think that there was this interesting wave of fans, creators who are collabing with trans folks, especially Black men who were tops with trans people. It was a weird rehash of racialized dynamics that to me was kind of interesting. And then we started to see, I think, more people sort of talk about either being attracted to trans men. And I'll say for myself, what I loved about that moment was seeing more trans male visibility, just because I don't think that that's as large of a visible community within the LGBTQ. But also, they're men, so men have privilege. So, I want to just sort of call that out. And then I would say that, the sad reality though, I was like, I hate to see that this might just become a passing trend that may not stick around. And, will people actually still, at the end of the day, hold space for these members of our community? And then I would say one of the other ones that I think follow this pattern are feet and scent play, and how people saying these things are gross. And now you have this being much more normalized. And so it makes me wonder, what are the next kinks that will become normalized that we think is a matter of time? Because, there are some things that I just thought, oh, now that people like that, because I could have sworn 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, y'all was saying that's nasty, even though you were following, liking, subscribing on your alt Twitter. So we're at 8:42, so I'm gonna call it here and just sort of see if there are any last questions. If not, I will look forward to eating dinner. I know there's a slight delay, so I will leave that there. But if not, thanks for showing up, especially you, my friend. Send me a message after. I appreciate how long you stayed here. You are the person who stayed the longest, and so I really, really appreciate that. I'm going to try to maybe do things like this again in the future, but I don't know when people are free, what their schedules are. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you another time. All right, let's figure out how to end this live. I will figure this out. I will figure this out. Lock panel. No. Okay, so we're good with that. And then, okay, so how do we how do we do this? How do we do this? How do we do this? I see it's this platform, and I'm trying to figure out how do I exit this dying highlights. Okay, I don't know how to bye. Okay. Oh, there we go. In live.